Welcome back. So with the bike stripped, I've had a little think about how I want to move forward. I've decided that the first stage will be rebuilding the rolling chassis. So that's the frame, the subframe, the swing arm, front and rear suspension, and then the wheels. And in the second stage, I'll move on to the engine. But in this video, I'm just going to focus on the frame, the subframe, and the swing arm. Let's get started. I took a good look at the subframe. It was free from damage and had only minor corrosion, but the paint wasn't looking that great, so I sent that off to the powder coaters and got started on the main frame. I needed to finish getting the bottom yoke out. And because of that slight dip in the top seal, I couldn't quite get my C-spanner in there to get a proper purchase. So I had to resort to the rudimentary method. Now the bearings didn't actually have any play in them, but as the bike had sat for many years off the road, I could feel the slightest notch. Plus I figured it was easy to do now while it was all apart anyway. I wiped the old grease out, flipped it over, and did the same on the other side. I prized off the rollers from the inner race of the lower bearing, and I set it aside for removal later. The top seal had actually cracked, so I ordered a new one ready for when it goes back in. Then I removed the engine mount spacers, as well as any other remaining bits of hardware attached to the frame. Next, I put my long screwdriver into the lip of the outer race and drove it out, switching sides with each hit of the hammer. Then I flipped it over to do the other side. This is a lot easier than having to work upside down if the bike is assembled. Now in order to do a proper job of cleaning up the frame, I drilled out the rivets holding the chassis plate so I could remove it. I took the frame outside so I could degrease it and clean off the years of grime. The area around the front sprocket needed extra attention, but I persevered and then wiped it down with a dry cloth, leaving it to dry in the sun under Buzz's supervision. With the frame dry, I took it back inside to polish up the main rails. Now I'm not personally a big fan of the polished look, so I'm actually going to give it a brushed finish after polishing. I swapped onto the buffing mop, and I have to admit, when it is all buffed up to a shine, it does look pretty nice. So to apply the brushed look, I dragged an abrasive pad down the length of the frame, trying my best to keep it in a straight line. I repeated that motion until I got the desired look, then swapped onto the other side. refitted the chassis plate with fresh pop rivets, and then it was time to put the new bearing races in the headstock. I heated up the area with a torch, and I'd had the races in the freezer. This makes them a little bit easier to drive home. I used the old one as a drift to help spread the impact, working around all sides until it hit the lip in the frame. You can tell when it does because the sound changes. Then I flipped the frame over and did the other side. So let's get started on the swing arm. Now not only is this also filthy, especially on the chain side, it actually has damage from paddock stands, which I'll try my best to remove, or at least reduce. I started by stripping the various bits and bobs, including the chain guard and the bracket for the rear brake line. I took the old chain adjuster bolts out, as I'll probably replace these with stainless ones. After a degrease and a good scrub, it was looking miles better, but it still needed some work. I also didn't like that the original paint was still on half the swing arm, so I brushed on some paint stripper to take it back to the bare aluminium. This is actually the first time I've used paint stripper, and I can confirm it is messy as hell. I put the Scotch-Brite mop in the drill to clean up some of the cast areas, as well as refinish some of the corroded areas. Some parts needed extra attention with a wire wheel and the Dremel. For some reason, the hole on this bracket had a jagged metal edge on the rear of the bolt hole, so a quick file got that clean and flat again. I'm going to replace the bearings, as I might as well while I'm here, so off came the dust seals and the circlip. I didn't actually have the right size blind bearing puller, but one of my brake piston pullers was a good fit, so I used that with a slide hammer to pull the large bearing out. Well, this is going well. I pushed out the sleeve and I had a good look at it. There was some surface corrosion on the far end, but I couldn't really feel it when I ran my hand over it. Now to get the needle bearings out. There's one this side and then there's two on the other side. I put the blind puller in and tightened the nut to expand the lip to grip the back of the bearing. With a bit of heat to help it on its merry way, I got to work with the slide hammer. Another successful pull. This is going well. The other side will be the same, right? No. No, it will not. There was definitely some corrosion on this side. I couldn't actually get a good purchase with the lip behind the first bearing, as there wasn't a gap between them. After a lot of struggling, I finally found a technique that showed some promise. Okay, so basically I've now got to the point where I'm using this assembly as a bit of a guide, but this rod is attached to the bearing puller, which is, if you look underneath, knocking on the back of the second bearing. Now it's kind of squishing it and pulling it apart, but it is moving, so far it's the best success I've had. So with those finally out, I wanted to clean up the inner faces to remove that corrosion. I gave it an initial clean, then used some penetrating fluid on some very fine wet and dry. I took a look at the hardware that I'd taken off before. Now the plastic should clean up easily, but the bolts and bracket will need restoring. I put the hardware, including the spacers, in a rust removal solution and left it overnight. I did the same with the Swingarm pivot bolt and lock nuts. I actually ended up zinc plating these, but I'll go into more detail on that in the next video. Now it's time to try and remove the scratches on the swing arm. I started with 120 grit, working the 3-inch sander over the area. It's looking better, so I worked through the higher grades of paper until it was ready for a polish. Flipping to the other side was a similar story, so I repeated the same process. Well, that is much better. Using the abrasive pad again, I gave it the brush finish, making sure to keep the movements as straight as possible. Well, I'm pretty happy with that. Now I can put the new bearings in. I lined up the bearings and seals and I started to pack them with grease. Then I stuck them in the freezer to chill out. I always wonder why it's not symmetrical and it has a larger bearing on one side. If you know, let me know in the comments, but wrong answers only. I reckon it's because, like a man at the tailor's, the bike likes to dress its ball bearings to one side. I drew the frosty cold bearings into place, using a length of M10 threaded bar, some nuts and washers, and a socket. With the two bearings now in on the left, I did the same thing with the one on the right hand side. A quick check to make sure it was all the way in, and then I move on to the larger bearing. Then I put the circlip back, making sure it was seated properly in its groove. I put the dust seal in next, followed by the freshly zinc plated spacer. Flipped it over, then greased my shaft. You can tell my sense of humour is still aged 14. With that in, I fitted the other dust seal, using a socket to push it in square. Then I fitted the final spacer. I put some fresh grease in the bearings and on the sleeve where the swing arm joins the suspension linkage. Then I started to mount the other bits that I cleaned up. I decided to use new stainless bolts with a smear of copper grease on the threads just to reduce the chance of galvanic corrosion between the different metals. The chain slider was in great condition underneath all that grime, so I installed that next. It's starting to look really nice. Although I did realise that that's the wrong bolt, so I switched that back to the correct one, which I'd given a fresh lick of paint. I gave the brake line bracket a quick sandblast to remove the old paint and the corrosion. Then I gave it a fresh coat of satin black before reinstalling it on the swing arm. So there it is. I'm really happy with the brush finish, and you can barely see those scratches anymore. I guess there's just one thing left to do. I lined up the frame and swing arm on the workbench and reintroduced them to each other, being sure to align the square edge of the spacer against the corresponding notch on the frame. With a little bit of a wiggle, the pivot bolt went through, so I span that in by hand. Then I torqued it to spec. I span on the nut, but I struggled to torque it up on the bench, so I'll need to do this when it's back on the ground. I span on the lock nut and then gave the swing arm a lift up and down, feeling and listening for anything wrong. But it all felt really smooth. So that's it for this video, and while I'm waiting for the subframe to come back from the powder coaters, I can get started on the linkage, sort the yokes and replace the headstock bearings. So I'll see you then, but I can't tell you how good it feels to actually be assembling a motorbike on that workbench.